Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Did you know that the History of the Papacy is on YouTube now? So you can watch regular episodes on YouTube, or you can check out our new YouTube and video exclusive History of the Papacy in 10 minutes or less, hopefully less, ideally less episodes, where they're basically a documentary format where we have pictures. It's just a short snippet of church history in a real succinct bite, and I think you'll really enjoy them. So follow the links to YouTube, or you can just search in YouTube for the History of the Papacy. Now, just a little tiny bit about Patreon. Now, you know that we are back on patreon.com/History of the Papacy. You can find us there. You can search for History of the Papacy as well. There's 4 tiers, and each tier has its own benefits, but everybody gets access to advertisement-free episodes and early episodes, so you can be listening to future episodes in the present, which is really cool. But anyways, that's definitely one benefit. But the biggest benefit is you'll get to be a part of the club. You'll get to be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which is, you probably know by now, the diptychs are, in traditional Christianity, the list of bishops who are commemorated in order. And you'll want to get on that list early, because the earlier you join, the higher up you'll be on the list, and the sooner you'll be mentioned. So let us now commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, and John at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, who are all magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that absolute power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Now, this is part 2 of our series that I recorded with Garry Stevens on the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament. I have a new series that's already being planned on that's going to be really exciting, and I can't wait for you to hear it. But as a little aside, to get us through our spring break, we're going to have this really awesome series with Garry. Today we'll focus on 2 minor prophets, Amos and Hosea. These are early prophets with the very interesting messages, so I think you're going to really enjoy this. We're going to wrap up the series with a Q&A about the prophets and evaluate them on a completely highly subjective scale, which Garry and I came up with. So I think you're going to enjoy that episode as well. So get your questions and your comments, and if there's a rating factor you think we should include, send us that as well. And with that, we'll have another piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to yet another exciting and magnificent collaboration between the History in the Bible podcast and the History of the Papacy podcast. Today we are going to biblically tackle our first 2 minor prophets, Amos, and Hosea. Garry, how are you on this magnificent day?
It's a magnificent day here too. It's a nice sort of crispy winter's sunny day.
All right. So, are you ready to talk about 2 prophets who may be called minor, but they are definitely ready for the big leagues? We are, of course, talking about Amos and Hosea, and we did an introductory episode that people can go back and listen to. But in short, who were the 12 minor prophets?
In Jewish tradition, the big 3 prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Now, the 12 are a group of books included with the big 3 in the section of the Jewish Bible called Nevi'im, which means prophets. All of the little books of the 12 are very short, and together they're about as long as one of the big 3. And it's usually thought that the 12 have been passed down as one single scroll, because a single scroll would take the entire 12. Now, Christians decided that Daniel should join the big three to make the Fantastic Four, but they kept the 12 grouped together. And Christians are in minor disagreements about the order of each book within the collection that is called the 12. Now, today we're tackling Amos and Hosea, who are the earliest of the 12. They both lived in the kingdom of Israel in the 700s BCE, just in the decades before that kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. The other 10 of the 12 laboured in the kingdom of Judea. So Amos and Hosea are unique in being northern prophets.
So why are we talking about, we did the introductory episode, and people should definitely go back and listen to that because that sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about. Why were they put in a certain order, and which we did address in that first order? Why are we talking about Hosea and Amos first today?
Because they are believed to be the first chronologically of the 12. They are sometime after the prophets Elijah and Elisha, who are not one of the big four and not one of the 12. They don't even get their own books. One of these days we may get around to talking about them. So Hosea and Amos are the earliest that we have. And I think scholars we're pretty confident in dating that. And one of the books, I think, actually says which reign the guy started prophesying. In the reign of the northern king, Jeroboam II. Now, one thing I want to mention about prophets in general, I think the word prophet is a terrible word for these things. And I don't know how it really got settled into English as that word. In Hebrew, the word they use to describe all these people is navi, which means one who is called or one who announces. They are considered to be a conduit from God to men. One thing they are not at all are soothsayers. They're called prophets, but they hardly make any predictions, except in the most general sense, like, oh, Israel will be destroyed if you don't stop the bad things you're doing. They never say something like a hurricane is coming next Tuesday. So I think the word prophets is a little bit misleading. And the best way to look at them is that they are prominent people who became enshrined in tradition as messengers from God to lecture the Hebrews about what they are doing right and wrong. And typically, all of the members of the 12 tend to address a certain crisis of the time. And the crisis that Amos and Hosea are addressing is the growing strength of Assyria. Assyria, in these decades that they lived, is growing and growing and growing in power and slowly moving towards the northern kingdom of Israel. And the two prophets are very concerned about that. All the 12 have certain themes in common. They combine messages of doom with messages of hope. So on the one hand, they're saying, Israel or Judah, turn away from your evil ways or you will be destroyed. And in fact, a lot of them say, destruction is inevitable, like Jeremiah said, there's no getting out of this, guys, you are going down. But they do offer also a message of hope, that even if Israel or Judah is destroyed, God will eventually get around to rebuilding them or saving them. Now, we believe Hosea and Amos were very rough contemporaries. Hosea seems to have been rather longer lived. And the politics of the time, there's the wealthy kingdom of Israel in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south, this blob called the kingdom of Aram Damascus, and there's the Assyrian Empire waiting to pounce. And there's lots of other little kingdoms surrounding the Hebrew states. These little states are constantly squabbling with each other and also trying to work out what to do with Assyria. Sometimes one of these countries will say, I think we really ought to be allied to Assyria because otherwise they will munch us to death. Other times some of the kingdoms, these little petty kingdoms, say, no, we should band together and defend ourselves against Assyria. So that's the general politics. Although the kingdom of Israel is fairly politically stable and fairly wealthy, there is a sense of impending doom happening and an instability to the geopolitics of the whole region.
The kingdom of Aram Damascus will be mentioned in these books. What was that kingdom?
Most of the information we have about it actually comes from the Book of Kings, which goes into a fair amount of detail about wars between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Aram Damascus. And it names rulers. It's probably the most detailed history that we have in the Bible, which is a little bit odd. We don't seem to have any other sources. It was a Semitic or Aramaean kingdom centered on the ancient city of Damascus. And variants of it had been around since forever. But it was a mainly desert area. I don't know exactly how wealthy it was, but from what I understand, it was the major regional power. So Assyria's to the north, and that's not just a regional power, that's a global power in terms of these times. But Aram Damascus is the big kingdom, which is a perpetual gadfly to the kingdoms of Israel and the other little petty kingdoms. But I don't think we know much about it except for its final years, which are detailed in the books of Kings somewhere.
So Amos and Hosea, they're contemporaries living at about the same time. So let's dig in. Let's talk a little bit more about Amos. Amos, I'll probably say it about 15 different ways now. But
apparently it's pronounced Amos in Hebrew, but I think we should only say Amos if we're trying to be pretentious.
Okay, let's go for it then.
Okay, Amos. Amos is the earliest of the 12, and he's pretty much the exemplar of a prophet. You could read just Amos, and you would get the complete gist of all the other prophets. He's in a nice, compact little sense. He prophesied in Israel, but he wasn't an Israelite. He was a Judean, because remember, there's two kingdoms. He seems to have wandered northwards to lambast the Israelites about their wrongs. His message is mainly a social message. You could say he's the people's prophet. A lot of the other prophets attack one of the Hebrew kingdoms for not being religious enough, for not worshipping God the right way, for not following God's command. Amos isn't really like that. He tends to attack the government of the kingdom of Israel for being socially incompetent, for just caring about the rich. And his book, okay, well, let's start at the beginning. This is a perfectly typical opening for the book of a prophet. Amos 1:1. The words of Amos, a sheep breeder from Tekoa, who prophesied concerning Israel in the reigns of King Uzziah of Judah and of Jeroboam son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. We don't know what the earthquake was, but it's nice that he precisely dates himself. That is just so handy. He starts off with 6 little short oracles of doom. For example, Amos 1:3. Thus said Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they threatened Gilead. I will break the gate bars of Damascus, and the people of Aram shall be exiled to Kir, said Yahweh. Thus said Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they exiled an entire population, which they delivered to Edom. So his opening chapter is basically an attack on all the neighbours of Israel for being nasty to Israel.
When I read this book, especially that very first section, there's so many different things that you really have to know to make sense of it if you're looking at it from an outsider perspective. Damascus, Gilead, is Gilead a place or is it a person? Where is Kir? Gaza, so some of these places you might be able to Google Maps and find, but you're not going to likely find Edom on your map.
No, and you'd have to look up the reference to the Ammonites that he goes into. Yeah, you'd need a little encyclopedia, wouldn't you, to get any sort of context. You wouldn't start to try and convert someone to Judaism or Christianity by reading to him from the opening chapters of Amos. Amos, okay, he delivers a bunch of attacks on all of Israel's neighbours. But towards the end of his little diatribe, he gives a twist. And he goes, okay, Amos chapter 2. Thus said Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Israel, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. So Amos throws in a surprising twist. He spent the entire first chapter attacking all the nasty people outside of Israel. But then he turns his focus to Israel itself. And right here you have an example of his social concern. He says, because Israel has sold for silver those whose cause was just and the needy for a pair of sandals. So he is now attacking the people of Israel who, well, as he says, you who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. Father and son go to the same girl and thereby profane my holy name. I don't know, you got to like the guy for that. I mean, he's attacking social ills.
Yeah, he has something to say about everything.
He has something to say about everything. Well, he has nothing to say about, say, worshipping Baals, foreign gods, which a lot of the other prophets are absolutely preoccupied about. He never mentions that at all. So he never says that Israel is turning away from God in the sense that they are turning away from God and turning towards other gods. He's really just saying, no, you've forgotten what it is to worship God. And to worship God, you should treat the poor well. So I think he's the most amiable of the 12. You can actually understand him, and you can understand his concerns.
Yeah, I have to agree that this was one of the ones that you could actually read and make some sense out of. When we get into Hosea and some of the other ones, it's really dense to pick a message out of it.
Like any good prophet, Amos delivers a judgment against Israel. Chapter 3 of Amos, he says, assuredly, thus said my Lord God, an enemy all about the land. He shall strip you of your splendour, and your fortresses shall be plundered. In the next few chapters, he makes a series of attacks on Israel, and he says, no, you are going to be in big trouble unless you give up your foul ways. He also has a little interesting passage where he refers to the cows of Bashan.
Mm-hmm.
He says, hear this word, you cows of Bashan, on the hill of Samaria. Now, Bashan was apparently a fairly fertile area of Israel, and he's talking about the people. Now, to be called a cow was actually a compliment back in those days. Men are, strong like a bull, and women are, well, there's nothing wrong with being called a cow. It's just that it was the exact equivalent of the male compliment. There's your bull, there's your cow, aren't you great? You really couldn't try that these days, could you? And then Amos goes on to take what is in fact a compliment, and then in later verses he says, well, you're going to be cut up just like a cow and put into the slaughterhouse. Exit that metaphor, stage left.
Do we know much about Amos as a person, besides that they say that he was a sheep breeder?
No, we know absolutely nothing. I mean, we're lucky to know that he was a sheep breeder. That's like an encyclopedia's worth of knowledge for one of the minor prophets.
Yeah, I think that's a tough part of the minor prophets, is that they don't give a lot of biographical detail about them, which would help also to contextualize them. Besides a few snippets of dating.
I mean, we should be grateful we have the dating. I mean, I suspect that there's lots of legends about Amos, I don't know, from rabbinical times. But I mean, you couldn't possibly trust anything, could you? They'd be just fairy stories.
Yeah, I did read some different things that people had said in tradition about some of these people like Hosea and Amos, but they never referenced where that came from. So it was some folk tradition apparently, or maybe it was taken from the Torah or from later writings that passed down, but nothing that would come from like the source document of the Bible.
It'd be as accurate as stories about King Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't think of any Christian traditions about Amos.
Just that he's in there. Really, with Amos, everything that I read was really, how did it prefigure Christ?
Oh, right.
And that's really the Christian take on most of the minor prophets, but particularly with Amos.
How does he prefigure Christ?
Pretty much in the general, most metaphorical way. In Amos, it's pretty thin of how they compare that he prefigures Christ. But Hosea a little bit more. But yeah, not much with Amos.
Would it be just Amos's general social concern? I mean, passages like this. Okay, Amos 6, and he's attacking the rich. And he says, "Ah, you who are at ease in Zion, you notables of the leading nation, they lie on ivory beds, lolling on their couches. They drink straight from the wine bowls, and anoint themselves with the choicest oils. For they are not concerned about the ruin of Joseph. Assuredly, right soon, they shall head the column of exiles. They shall loll no more at festival meals." I mean, you could say that's perfectly in line with Jesus.
Yeah, anything you look for a Christian interpretation, it's just a few short lines.
I love the way that so many quotations from the Bible are just a few short lines. I mean, there is so much material in the Old and New Testaments. You could prove anything from it, couldn't you? Or use it to support anything you liked if you make the right excision of the text.
So he really just ends, and I mean, it's not a particularly strong ending. I mean, in the version of the Bible that I read him from, he's about 8 pages, maybe. No, not even, about 6 pages, not even full pages. So it's very short and to the point. Yeah, I think that Amos gets a pretty straightforward point. You can read it and you can get pretty much the gist that he's getting at. Now, Hosea is a different story.
Yes.
Now, one quick thing is, in the canon, if I'm not mistaken, Hosea usually comes first.
Yes, he said, checking his Bible.
Was there a thought to taking Amos first and presenting him first?
I'll bet Hosea is first because he's the longest of the 12.
Yeah, and he's quite I would say that it's still an easy read, and it's only a few pages long.
Unlike Amos, Hosea doesn't give a nice little dating thing, but I think maybe references in the prophet that I've completely forgotten about do enable us to date into the last decades of Israel. Now, Hosea is unique in that he is the only native Israelite prophet of the 12. Amos, remember, was a Judean who decided to leave Judea and walk to Israel to attack them. But Hosea is actually a native. Apparently, the Hebrew text is extremely difficult. The book of Job is considered difficult, and Hosea is also considered almost impenetrable.
So are they saying with grammatically and structurally and the vocabulary, it's the way it's written?
I'm not sure. I think maybe it's like reading one of those particularly sort of avant-garde novels. And the vocabulary is straightforward, the grammar is straightforward, but you've got no idea what they're on about. And you're wondering why you borrowed the thing from the library in the first place.
Like a Salman Rushdie novel.
Yeah, maybe a Salman, anything that's won a prize.
Yes.
Now, his name may be a shortened version of Yahweh has saved. He's odd amongst the 12 in that his ministry is wrapped up in his own life. And some people call this an example of an incarnational ministry, that to talk is to live and to be that, or whatever the technical definition of incarnational is.
Yeah. When you're reading, when I read Hosea as a layman cracking it open, it was pretty impenetrable to get to a point. It's very metaphorical, and it's written, I think you described it as poetically. It presents itself as Hosea is talking and like this is really happening to him, but it's clearly not happening to him.
And I think we want to give our listeners and viewers an opening taste of Hosea. He starts off utterly unlike Amos, which is a nice straightforward introduction. Hosea starts off with, okay, this is Hosea 1:2. When Yahweh first spoke to Hosea, Yahweh said to Hosea, "Go get yourself a wife of whoredom, and children of whoredom, for the land will stray from following Yahweh." So he went and married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim. She conceived and bore him a son, and Yahweh instructed him, "Name him Jezreel, for I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the bloody deeds of Jezreel and put an end to the monarchy of the house of Israel." Okay, now that's weird. Now again, you're going to need some extra knowledge here. House of Jehu refers to the current dynastic line of Israel. Jezreel is a place. So God has told him to name a son, Jezreel. Jezreel is a place which became famous in connection with an incident with King Ahab, where a vintner called Naboth had refused to sell his vineyard to King Ahab. So Ahab's wife, Jezebel, we know that name, Jezebel, has him stoned to death. Ahab and Jezebel have terrible reputations in Jewish tradition. So by God telling Hosea to name his kid Jezreel, it'd be like saying, okay, I want you to name him Auschwitz, or something like that. It's just not a good thing. Anyway, the next verse in Hosea is, she conceived again and bore a daughter. And God said to him, "Name her Not Accepted, or Unpitied, for I will no longer accept the house of Israel or pardon them. But," in brackets, Hosea says, "but I will accept the house of Judah, the southern kingdom." And then his wife conceives a second son. And God says to Hosea, "Call him Not My People, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God." Now, you're wondering what's going on here. Yeah, is this real?
And as a person, God's telling Hosea that you're going to marry Gomer and you're going to have 3 kids. All right, yeah, that's great. But then, like at every step, there's a thorn in all of that. And every single one of those roses, there's a gigantic thorn. And Hosea knows it going into it.
Yes, he does. I mean, there's a certain perversity to the prophet, isn't there? If this is how he's starting off his book. He's not a happy man. He's angry. He's angry at the people of Israel. Now, apparently some of the complexity of Hosea is revealed in these sentences. It's not entirely certain, the phrase, "go get yourself a wife," it's not entirely certain in the Hebrew whether it actually means marry this woman or have sex with her. So is she a prostitute? The Hebrew word isha used can mean both woman and wife, and it's not entirely clear which one is meant here. There's the phrase used, "a woman of prostitutions," which occurs nowhere else in the Old Testament. And it's literally that, woman of prostitutions, plural, and apparently only the King James Version translates it correctly. Most other Bibles say woman of prostitution, singular. Hosea then launches into marriage imagery and the imagery of a lawsuit. Hosea is the first prophet to describe the relationship of Israel and God as a marriage. And he describes this in terms of adultery. Unlike Amos, Hosea is preoccupied with Israel's unfaithfulness towards God. And he describes this in terms of adultery. That Israel has whored after whores. I hate using that word. Israel has violated the marriage. He uses a lot of sexual and family metaphors, which often doesn't go down well with, if you're reading the book, it seems a bit
heavy-handed. Yeah, it's not what you would expect, I would say.
And Hosea also introduces the concept of a lawsuit, or a riv, which is brought by God against his people. Other prophets would use that concept later on. So God basically charges Israel with violating the terms of the covenant and marriage. He says Israel is indebted to God for giving them the law, for making an agreement with them to protect and preserve them for all time. Israel should be placing its confidence entirely with Yahweh. Now, there's a bit of political context to this. At the time that Hosea is writing, there's a lot of discussion inside Israel whether they should join an anti-Assyrian alliance with all these other little petty kingdoms. And Hosea is basically saying, no. If Assyria is going to take you out, it is God's will. In fact, you would be offending God if you do anything to thwart his will, which is being annihilated by Assyria. I don't know how that went down with his contemporaries. But Hosea just says, have complete trust in God. He'll protect you. Didn't quite work out that way for the Israelites, but there you go.
Judah did survive, though, in a way, from the Assyrians.
Yes, they had the happy privilege of not being conquered by Assyria and the unhappy indignity of being conquered by the Babylonians. So Assyria took out Israel. No one wanted to be conquered by the Assyrians. The Assyrian conquest of Israel happened because of some bizarre politics. And this is really towards the very end that Hosea is writing. The kingdoms of Israel and its neighbour Aram Damascus are trying to get together an anti-Assyrian coalition, and they decide to protect their flank by attacking their southern neighbour of Judah. They're going to be facing Assyria to the north. They want to protect the south, so they band together and attack Judah. Well, what does Judah do? Judah invites Assyria to help it. Now, you've got to be in bad straits if you invite Assyria to help you. You might as well invite the Borg to defend, to help you defend Mercury. So Assyria takes up the invitation, whacks the kingdom of Aram Damascus, and eventually conquers Israel. So you could say the proximate cause of the destruction of Israel by the Assyrians is because Judah invited the Assyrians to do just that.
And the Israel were co-religionists with Judah, but I'm assuming Aram Damascus was not?
I presume they had the usual sort of Semitic polytheism. And certainly Israel and Judah felt a kinship to each other, although we don't know how strong that really was. I mean, the Bible goes out of its way to say that, Israel is the errant brother who did not accept the house of David, which was running Judah. But there's a lot of archaeological evidence that they're actually really quite different. I mean, as far as we know at this time, polytheism was still fairly rampant in Israel, because we find lots of little statues of God's wife, Asherah. But certainly they felt there was some sort of kinship.
So let's talk a little bit about Hosea and his prophetic announcements. That's getting towards the end of the book. And again, it is dense language that's used in this book. I found that it even got kind of difficult of who's speaking. It did, it would switch, and you'd think, okay, is that God talking right now? Is that Hosea talking?
That is true. It's really hard to tell, isn't it?
Yeah, I found that really hard to follow.
And in fact, listen to this, guys. Hosea 4:1. See if you can work out if it is God or Hosea. Hear the word of Yahweh, O people of Israel. For Yahweh has a case, a lawsuit, against the inhabitants of this land, because there is no honesty and no goodness, and no obedience to God in the land. False swearing, dishonesty and murder, and theft and adultery are rife. I mean, it starts off, and hear the word of Yahweh, but God could be saying that.
Yeah.
And then Hosea goes on, chapter 8, he says, they sow wind and shall reap whirlwind. Israel is bewildered. They have now become among the nations like an unwanted vessel. And he's saying all this because they're considering joining an anti-Assyrian alliance. But even though he's full of doom and misery, he concludes with a little message of love. Okay, so in the very final chapter, and this has got to be God speaking, it can't be the prophet. Okay, 11:1, I fell in love with Israel when he was still a child, and I have called him my son ever since Egypt. I have pampered Ephraim, taking them in my arms. But they have ignored my healing care. I drew them with ties, with cords of love. And it goes on, how can I possibly give you up, O Ephraim? How surrender you, O Israel? I have had a change of heart. Now that's in one of the last lines of the last chapter. God says, no, okay, right. I am going to destroy you, but maybe not destroy you that much. So it's a message of hope, but it isn't exactly a
happy hope, kind of.
It's not overwhelmingly, I will stop all this doom. It's more like, well, yeah, you're going to be utterly wiped out, but don't worry, it won't be that bad.
In this context, Ephraim is referring to a place and not a person.
Ephraim is a synonym for Israel.
Oh, okay. You see, again, unless you're reading along, and even in the Bible that I read, these, and they didn't have the footnotes, because I think if you had footnotes for everything, you'd probably have about a page of footnotes for every page of text.
Yeah. In fact, I think Ephraim is a person. It's one of the tribes. Of course, the tribe of Ephraim.
So Ephraim is a tribe, one of the tribes of Israel, but then they don't mention any of the other tribes in there.
Ephraim and Manasseh, I think, are the two big tribes of the northern kingdoms. And Ephraim seems to have come to be used as a synonym for all of them.
Were these tribes then at that point almost like maybe provinces of Judah and Israel?
I think we have some evidence from the very end of the kingdom of Judah, which is several centuries in the future, that was the case, that there were still sort of tribal boundaries or something.
Like a political subdivide.
So I'd say probably yes.
A very strange book. The first two are tough to make something out of. I can't wait to dig into the other ones and see what they have to offer.
I think the psalm about Amos is a nice standard little prophet with a good social message. Hosea is a barking man, difficult to understand, man who is really violently angry at his own people. And he says, unless you change, you are going to be destroyed. As far as we know, Hosea, although he lived when the Assyrian menaces were becoming more and more obvious, he did not actually live to see the destruction of his kingdom. I suppose if he had, he would have added a paragraph at the end. See, I told you.
And I could see that you could interpret that first part of Hosea as, with all the whoredom and all that, as misogynist. But you could take it that way, but I also think it was so metaphorical. But the whole thing of marriage and Israel is married to God and God is taking it out on. It's this weird conversation that goes back and forth, and it's really difficult to follow where they're coming from and what's the point.
I mean, Hosea does have some passages which are quite hopeful, and in fact, they feature fairly strongly in Jewish liturgy, whereas, well, both Amos and Hosea in the Christian tradition, they do appear in the lectionary for some Sunday services. But I don't think any Christian would be saying, oh yes, I remember that sermon on Amos chapter 6. But in the Jewish tradition, there's one particular passage which is cited very, very often for the winding of the tefillin, or tefillin, the straps on the arm. It's interesting, looking up pronunciations. I've read tefillin or tefillin, or I've heard both of them, and both seem to be in widespread use. But you know how sometimes you're not quite sure how something is really pronounced? But fortunately, the pronunciation tefillin, I actually got from the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, Lord Sachs, and you really don't get a better authority than that. So I heard him say it. Anyway, the passage which is used in this little ritual is from Hosea 2:21. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in kindness and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. So this little passage of hope in a book which is mainly doom has been singled out and is put in the liturgy, and it appears in various other Sabbath services in the Jewish tradition. So you can get some hope out of even the most barking mad book.
Well, we'll see with these ones if we've gotten, at least with Hosea, out of the way, the hopeless one, and we're on our upward climb here to something a little bit more hopeful. Maybe not. Well, I think we'll have some ups and some downs given some of the other books, but Hosea was a tough one.
It is. All that stuff about marriage and being unfaithful and being married to God and the lawsuit. Although all these images do appear in later prophets, here they are strongest and first used. If you've never come across them before, they come across as just sort of weird, don't they?
There was 10 more minor prophets to go. Garry, if they want to find your podcast, I'm sure at this point, if everybody's listening, they know where to find your podcast, but it bears repeating.
Just Google History in the Bible, and you should find it.
And of course, you can find my podcast at a2zhistorypage.com. And it's sometimes, if you search for History of the Papacy podcast, it usually shows up towards the top of the list.
Only sometimes.
How Google's feeling that day.
I mean, how many History of the Papacy podcasts are there out
Just
there?
one. But
That's what I thought.
Other things seem to squeeze in there. Well, we will definitely see you next time with more minor prophets who are definitely not minor in our book. Talk to you next time.
Toodles.